seems to be tripling in its number because of the coronavirus. So, ladies and gentlemen, my guest is a law professor, and she's also an author of Princeton Fugitive Slave, The Trials of James Collins Johnson. Thank you so much. I need to read that book, and I need one signed by you.
All right. Well, either the next time I get to you in Nigeria or when you come here, I'd love to.
Okay, perfect. All right, so let's start by talking about being a woman in the 21st century. One would have thought that, in the 1918s or in the 1950s, women would still be oppressed or subjected to these kind of violences. And in the 21st century, we'd hope that we have gone past that and we'll be talking about other things like going to the moon. Why do you think it's still prevalent that we still have to deal with gender-based violence, especially in a pandemic situation such as this?
Oh, there's so much to say about this. I suppose the first thing I would remark upon is the tremendous irony that during this COVID crisis, for example, when women, men, and children, when everybody is more at home than ever before, that's when there's been an uptick in domestic violence, including sexual violence. The irony is that cultures around the world have long said that a woman's place is in the home, and yet here is the very place where she finds herself unsafe. I think much of the problem that we are seeing, regrettably, is that notwithstanding the tremendous changes, progress, people on the moon, I don't know that most cultures around the world have come to understand and look at women in all their full humanity. So that's where I would start.
Okay.
That is, to me, is the biggest issue. That's the crux of it. We need everybody. We need men. We need women themselves to understand that they are human beings. They are part of humanity first. And that has to cut across culture and custom and nation.
I just want to ask, because, half the time where women are saying men are not supportive of us, the men are putting us down, the men are not there for us. And the men also respond in a funny way, saying, how many women really support women? And this is a question I also ask. Do women really support women? Are we there for each other in the first instance? So that maybe if the men see that we're together, maybe they could support us. So do you see that as a challenge also?
I absolutely see that as a challenge. So when I think about the mechanisms for improving women's position throughout the world, I actually think we have to start with girls and women, and we have to understand our own inherent value, not just to men, not to the world, but to ourselves. Mm-hmm. Look, for example, at the United States. When we look at politics here, there have been many women who have complained about our current presidential administration. People, when they make those complaints, what they have tended to ignore is that the majority of women in this country actually voted for the administration that we have. That often is because women, when they look at the opportunities to express themselves politically, socially, economically, they still often put men first and not women first. We have to get to the point where women look at, for example, a woman candidate, a woman boss, a woman CEO, and see her as fully capable as any man. And so while I would say that when you think about things like sexual violence, domestic violence, certainly we need to educate men. But to tell you the truth, at the same time, and maybe even first, we need to educate girls and women to understand and appreciate their own self-worth.
Now, globally, there's been a spike at the beginning of coronavirus in December last year. And then at the middle of lockdown, countries like Sweden, Australia, even Africa had a spike in domestic violence and sexual violence. And I'm thinking to myself, if we want to break this cycle, if we want to address this issue, because before we go into the realities of the fact that people are getting raped, whether we believe it or not, people are getting abused by their partners, how do we get people to have these conversations? Because in my part of the world, there are people who are victims of gender-based violence, but they cannot speak up about it because maybe somebody in the family, who sometimes the woman, is saying, oh, don't say anything, you're going to embarrass this family, you're going to bring a bad name. Where do we even start to convince people to have these conversations?
I think it has to start very early. I would certainly say that even here in the United States, except for very large cities, very much urban areas where people are well educated, we have the very same problems. I mean, in fact, if we look at the statistics, what we find is that women very rarely report this, especially in more rural areas, especially in places where they still live close to their extended family. And so we have very much the same problems. If it seems that the US has made any further advances on this, it's because I think we often look at this very small demographic of those women who are vocal, those women who are educated, those women who live in urban areas. We have to go out and talk to what is effectively that average woman, and that is a woman who is not necessarily well educated. That is a woman who is very much attached to her birth family. We have to talk to those women, and we have to talk about sex and sexuality, and those are hard topics for anywhere. I mean, I think it's shocking. You have to talk to children who are as young as 2 or 3 years old.
I was about to say that maybe when I was growing up, it was a difficult conversation, but it's everywhere. Can we not have that conversation? Why is it still difficult?
But that has to do with, I think, the whole idea of understanding women's full humanity. Many of us are taught, frankly, we're taught to behave as if we're Barbie dolls with no sexual parts at all until this magic day in puberty, and then many of us are shocked. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
We have to start before that happens, and we have to educate boys and girls, men and women. But things being what they are, I would just start with the children, because that's going to give us the best grip on the future and give us the best chance.
From where you stand, do you think that enough sex education is being taught in schools? Do you think the government is pushing this? Do you think that non-governmental organizations and women who are for feminism and other things are pushing enough for these conversations to be had at home and in classrooms?
I would have to say in simple words, no. So for example, here in the United States, when we talk broadly about the educational system, what you find is, of course, we have 50 states and we have a few territories. Not only are we dealing with multiple differences across state jurisdictions, here's the really difficult part. Within one single state, even a very small state, let's pick like New Jersey or someplace, there are hundreds of school districts. So there are hundreds of educational fiefdoms where school leaders can decide whether or not to engage in that conversation. And so given this sort of multiplicity of educational jurisdictions, that is a tremendous challenge to overcome. And to this day, only the very most progressive districts have anything that even resembles sex education. And when I say sex education, I include things like sexuality, or I even include things like learning the correct parts of the names of parts of our body. We're not even getting to things like reproduction or sexual assault or sexually transmitted diseases. I think we would be vastly enriched here in the U.S. if we just taught children to understand that they are human beings, that they are sexual beings, and those two things are not mutually exclusive. That's what's not happening.
Still talking about educating, again, from the African perspective, it's the woman who's the main focus. You're told how to sit, how to talk, what to do, how to respond to people, how to present yourself, what to wear. But nobody really pays attention to the boy child. Nobody's saying you shouldn't touch a lady this way, you shouldn't speak to a lady. So I want to know if that's the same thing, the same problem that's happening across boards, and what should we be doing now? Because sexual abuse is on the rise, domestic, emotional abuse, all kinds of things are happening, and it swings both ways. Although women are more on the receiving end, what should we be doing to close that gap?
Again, it does come to education, but I'm also very much in favor of what I would call progressive ongoing protest. So, for example, you're familiar with the fact that here in the U.S., we are right in the middle of a Black Lives Matter renaissance. That's a movement that's been going for years, but suddenly it's important. We're also have an ongoing Me Too movement, which to some extent is going global, and that's where women are calling out and saying, I've been subject to sexual harassment or sexual abuse. Yes, education is important, but before we get to that, I think that women themselves are going to have to get comfortable with being more vocal. And that is one reason why I very much am in favor of, and I hope that the Me Too movement will continue to gain steam. Women have to simply speak out, especially well-regarded women, highly placed women. Those are the women who, regrettably, whose voices are going to count, and we need those women to stand up first and foremost and say, yes, this is a problem, or and say, yes, it happened to me, it happened to someone in my family, it happened to my neighbor, and I want it to stop.
Okay, I'm sorry to talk over you, but these same women you're asking to speak up may speak up, but then somebody says, "Oh, that's a lie. She's just trying to get attention." So there's also society saying, "I'll give you the Nigerian example or the African example. What were you wearing? Mm-hmm. What were you doing there? How? I mean, what kind of attention were you giving him?" You know, these are questions. So you're already judged even before you even, you know. So how do you deal with that? Because we're trying to get people to speak up, but then there's society also there in their faces. So how do you deal with that?
We have to reject that narrative of what we like to call here in the U.S. of slut shaming. That is to say, the notion that a woman cannot dress attractively, a woman cannot speak with or smile at a man without it being assumed that she's seeking sexual attention. That's what I mean when I say that we have to center women's humanity. We have to center women's humanity, and that does not mean that we have to have downcast eyes or dress in a way that men deem modest. And so, yes, women do have to speak up, and they have to speak up forcefully, and they have to push back on that narrative. I know it's hard, but you know, there are some powerful women in this society. I regret to say that some of us, we keep quiet because we say, I'm comfortable, that won't happen to me. And that's exactly the wrong thing to do. We have to come together. We have to coalesce. And that means that the powerful will have to support the less powerful. That's the only way this is going to work.
Now, how do we also bring the men in on this conversation? Because whether we like it or not, they're very essential one way or the other. How do we bring the men in when it comes to these issues of sexual violence, speaking up, confiding in someone, not being slut shamed, and not being judged or given a tag of some sort, to say, oh, that's Marianne who was raped and she had got pregnant for her, you know, abuser. How do we get men to be on that table with us?
I think just as women need to speak more forcefully, I actually think we also need to call out men and not collectively, individually. So there are often male leaders or even people in our families and our communities who say, I abhor sexual violence. You know what? I need them to not just quietly say that to me or to a few other women. I need them to speak out as well. I think something that is not sufficiently understood is that there are men who are feminists. Feminist is not a bad word. To be feminist is to appreciate and understand the capacities of women as human beings. And so I would say, just as we need to enlist the powerful women to speak out, the powerful men have to be comfortable doing that. It is the only way that other men will follow. We have to shame abusers. We have to shame the abusers.
Talking about shaming the abusers, there's this trend of, recently, since 2018, Nigeria has experienced a high number of rape cases. 2-year-olds being abused by 20, 60-year-olds, you know, you have even babies are, you know, sexually abused, women and girls. And half the time, if these women try to, maybe after so many years, sum up the courage to say, this is what happened to me, most of these people who have monies, you know, hit you with a charge or a lawsuit or something, knowing that, you know, I don't know how it works in the US, but in these parts, you know, if you do not have the money to go to court, you obviously will scare off and be like, oh well. So like, we have a case right now, a very famous musician has been accused of rape, and, you know, from what we hear, the girl was threatened, her mother was threatened. We're not sure that she was put behind bars, you know, she was locked up and stuff like that. So when we have people who seem to be powerful, who have been accused doing this, where does the law, where does the law come in? Because I know in every country there is a law against rape. In Nigeria, I think it's 14 years. There are people who are actually advocating for the death penalty, but we might not go there. So how do you take your own step as someone who's been abused?
That, I think, that is one of the most difficult aspects of this. Here in the U.S., for example, we mostly rely upon state laws, when it comes to rape. We actually don't have a singular or a unitary federal law, but even in the case of those state laws, they often don't work. And as you said, powerful men can often mount tremendous defenses. I think, ultimately, that to fight these kinds of individuals, it's not going to be law, it's going to be society. It's going to be women going out there and talking to other people, other men, other women, and asking them to stand with them. Something that I would imagine creatively would be for raped women to not stand alone. Rape is a harm not just to the woman, but to her family, to her community. Imagine if it were possible for a rape victim to bring a suit, not individually, but collectively, with a whole unit that's harmed. If a woman is a mother, it hurts her children. If she's married, it hurts her husband. If she is a worker in a community, it hurts all of them. We need to reform our laws to, I think, take away this sort of focus, laser focus on just the woman herself. This has to be seen as a crime against humanity. And when I say humanity, I mean humanity in sort of units, families, companies, societies. We've got to get past this idea that you are a lone woman standing out there crying in the wilderness when you've been raped. That's what has to change. I say this to my law students all the time, especially my women law students. I say, I am here to teach you the law, but I'm here to teach you because I need you to be creative, because I need you to legislate. That's what is needed. We can't sit here and sort of parse existing laws. We both know that has been of little utility. Yeah. We need legislation that reimagines and understands this crime for what it is. It is a collective crime against your entire familial or social unit, and that's the way it ought to be brought. And that's what I mean when I say shame the abusers. If an abuser sees an entire community coming for him, and it's mostly a him, but not always, then that's going to help us stop this. Because this is a plague.
Yeah, it is. It's considered, as we speak, a social pandemic of sorts, because just as we're, trying to handle the coronavirus, we're also having to handle this on the side, with helplines all over the places. What about the people who live in rural areas who do not have access to, these helplines, who are unable to go to the police without being slut shamed, as you said? Now, there is a video that was trending in Nigeria for a long time where a federal lawmaker walks into a sex shop, a toy shop, and assaults, the storekeeper, slaps her over and over, and then drags her with some police officers into his vehicle. Now, it took the whole rage of Nigeria to get this man to be brought to book, but he didn't go to jail or anything. He was just, he wiggled his way out. So really, how much power do we have as a crowd filing behind a person? Does it just have a momentary effect, and thereafter, it fizzles away? How do we press on to make sure that people really are penalized for these kinds of abuses?
Again, I think it comes down to society. We cannot always depend upon the law to enact its punishment. I'm thinking of a case that happened several years ago in California, where a young college student raped a little girl in a bathroom and killed her. It was just a horrible, horrible thing. And wow. He did this, and one of his friends from school stood there and watched and said nothing. Well, the law was able to some extent to punish the rapist, but not nearly enough. What was perhaps more shocking is that there was this companion who watched everything and did nothing, and the law could do nothing, because at the time in California didn't have a law that required, those who were standing by to do anything, to intervene. The law was changed, but too late for this man. This man was effectively shunned. He was shunned at his college campus. He was unable to get jobs. His name just lives on, in perfidy. if we don't have the law, then we will have to rely upon things like social shaming. I don't believe in violence because I think that is a slippery slope. So I would never advocate that. But I do believe that we as a society, we do have to collectively turn our backs on people who do this when the law will not take care of us. We can't simply bow our heads and say, well, the abuser, the rapist wasn't convicted, oh well, and let that person go on living their life. We do have the power to not include them socially, to not include them economically. We have that power. You see that, for example, here in the U.S., you may be familiar with where Black people are filming sort of abusive white people and the person loses their job. That's actually a prime example of contemporary social shaming. These people, there's sometimes nothing law can do when you're just sort of abusive verbally, but very often society can do and should do what I would call the regulatory work, meaning there's more than one way of regulating society, and if you depend only on existing law, then we're not going to get anywhere, because we know that existing laws, they are wielded by the powerful, but we as individuals, these people, we as collectives, we have far more power than we imagine. To me, that's the excitement. The very fact that I'm talking to you from thousands of miles away on social media, we have this power. We have this power. We have to wield it.
Interesting. Still talking about the power. I'm thinking I want you to make recommendations, because there are support groups for alcoholics. There are support groups for sex offenders in the US. What is the US doing that we can learn to also incorporate it into the African system, where we can help victims of rape, abuse, domestic and violence? I mean, there was a lady who died in her husband's house because every time she was hit by him and she went home to her parents would say, well, it's your husband. What are you going to do? I have no space in my house. Go back to your husband, apologize to him, and let it go. And that was it. So one day she ended up dead. If she was allowed to go home, or there was somebody to give her the kind of advice that she needed, probably she wouldn't have turned up dead. So what do we need to learn from the American system that can help us here?
I think one of the most important things that is helping a lot of women here in the U.S. who are abused, whether physically abused, raped, etc., within the home, is that it's not perfect, but we have a fairly robust system of domestic violence shelters where, for example, women can be educated and learn new skills and get work. Meaning, one of the things, besides, of course, family ties and customs, one of the things that keeps women tied to abusers is the fact that they don't have economic independence and they're not necessarily well educated. I think that, for example, is something that can be done outside of a legal framework. Women and girls need to be educated. Girls need to stay in school. We may not be able to protect them from certain harms, but to the extent that women are educated well enough to go out on their own and make a living, and live alone if necessary, that will help them. The other thing is that in the U.S., I think it is more accepted for women to form families of affinity, meaning families, groups of men and women, entire communities who may have to take the place of that abusive family or that family that's condoning your abuser. That is one of the most difficult things that I have had to do or to say to young women, and that is to say, look, sometimes your birth family, they don't have your best interest at heart. That doesn't mean you have to spend your life alone. You need to be able to go out, earn a living, and form a family of affinity. And that's one of the things that I think may be different here. And I think for better or for worse, here in the U.S., there are greater norms of sort of independence and even anonymity, meaning a young woman of, say, 19 years old could take a bus from New York to Los Angeles and start a new life. People wouldn't necessarily raise eyebrows at it. Part of that has to do with there is a rigid position of women going out on their own and supporting themselves and creating new family-like units. And so I think that might be helpful for women in Nigeria. And again, that has to be on the grassroots. You don't legislate that. You don't put out notices. You don't even hand out forms at school. I actually think even in rural areas, it's word of mouth. You talk to women, you form alliances and groups that they can join. You make women confident in the fact that they could live a life, and a good life, without the abuse. We are worthy people. We as women need to understand, and we don't need to live in these ways. That's what has to happen.
My next question is based on something somebody just posted. Clever Shade. This is stereotypical of what happens when a woman says, I've been raped. Men will say, well, men are also raped. Why is it always about the women? It's too lopsided. It's one-sided. And he's saying, let's hear from a man's perspective. We only hear from women, and it looks lopsided. I'd like to let Clever Shade know that from statistics, women are more recipients of gender-based violence. The percentage for men is pretty low. So let's not make this about the men, and it's not a debate. We're looking at how we can reduce the number of gender-based violence. And then when we talk about gender-based violence, half the time it's a woman who's being bitten, it's a woman who's been raped, it's a woman who's being abused. So like I asked earlier on, how do we bring men into this? But let's just address Clever's message because he's here. So let's address that.
So that is to say, how do we address the fact that men are sometimes sexually abused?
Yeah, well, he's saying that we always talk about the women. Why can't we hear from a man's perspective? It's lopsided.
Very often that, and while fully acknowledging that men are abused, and that is just as horrible as when women are abused, men are still much more empowered in almost every society in the U.S. When men are abused, sometimes they speak out, sometimes they don't, but in either case, men wield power, even as victims. They simply are better able to weather these storms. And as I just said a moment ago, a man, for example, has more ability, more power, more opportunity to go off on his own, to avoid the abuser, to have the economic or the educational wherewithal to build a life away from those individuals. That's why we're talking about something different. Women are often multiply oppressed. So there's the domestic violence and or sexual violence. There is what I would even call economic and social violence, because we are often regarded as less than men. That is why women need to be centered in this conversation, because we have so many levels of oppression to overcome. That is why.
Okay, another question. In terms of reaching out, because you just said men are able to go off on their own and do a lot of things. Well, we would also say that, look, the 21st century woman is empowered somewhat. The 21st century woman is asking for equal rights, or see me as a human being, just as you are. Give me a seat at the table. Why is she unable to break free? I tell you what, there's a story, a woman posted a story of her abuser who raped her, and she got pregnant. She had two boys, and they're so grown up now. And she said she totally turned a new leaf, and she said, look, I forgive him. What he did was terrible, but every time I look at these kids, they give me hope. But then flip the coin, another woman would say, every time I see this kid, I want to kill this kid. So what's the difference between these two people?
In terms of how those women view the offspring of rape? Yes. That is so very individual. I think one of the most important things that we as a society, we as people who wield law, is we have to give women room to feel either way about it. Meaning, I don't advocate that any woman should necessarily have to forgive her abuser, especially if he fathered children. Nor do I feel that we should blame women who don't, for example, want to keep or care for the children of her abuser. This is very much individual. And this goes back to the fact that we as women, we're individual human beings. Of course, we're going to feel different ways about this. What we need is the space to make the choice of how to feel, how to behave, how to respond in the light of these crises. I mean, I think that there's some very well-meaning people who say, well, we are going to help women who are raped by fill in the blank. You know, no, women, the most important thing that abused women need, whether it's domestic violence or sexual violence, the most important thing they need is the agency to make their own decision, you know, about how to respond. We're victimizing them all over again when we decide how they should feel and how they should respond. So
I will come back. I will come back with a question, but I just want to let people who are watching us there's a question button at the bottom of your screen. Please ask a question. Unfortunately, we don't have too much time because we had to reschedule this interview. If you have a question, we're talking about gender-based violence, we're talking about rape, we're talking about how people should feel, what they should know, the myths and the realities. Oh, Patty here is sending a message from Brazil. She says, we in Brazil have a crime name for crimes committed against women because they are women. Feminicidio, she calls it. Something like feminicide. Okay, so people who make them enter into a different law. I don't know if you have any idea, as to the laws in Brazil. Yeah. So if you have questions about rape, if you have questions about gender-based violence, please feel free. The question button is at the bottom of the screen. Put your question up there. When I click on it, Miss Lolita and I could see the questions. Clever Shay here says, I keep crying about this subject matter because I'm a rape victim, which I never ever want to share with anyone. It pains me to know that the lady who raped me is going about shouting that rape is evil. So again, sometimes perpetrators of these evil acts are in the forefront of, canvassing for or against rape. So how do you even talk about it? Because the musician in Nigeria I told you about, who's been accused of rape, the lady who spoke up because she saw him saying, "Oh, rape is bad, it's evil." And she's saying, look, you raped me, so how come you're in the forefront? How do we sieve the clay from the shaft in this instance?
I think when we talk about educating people, one of the first things that we need to do is question ourselves and our own actions. I think it's very easy for people, both men and women, to decide there are bad people out there, there are rapists out there. Of course, that's not me. We need to examine our own actions first. I think that if there's going to be training and education, that's what we need to do. And I think that's even true with children to some extent, because as we know, very often sexual violence happens among groups of children. And I think it's easy for them to sort of put it aside. Oh, it was a joke. Oh, it was fun. We need to be taught to explore very closely our own actions before we can start casting stones at other people. And that's often a forgotten component of training, I think. Training, so we'll say, oh, you need to recognize when there is an abuser, when it's going on. You need to recognize whether you're part of the problem. And too much training neglects that important first step, I think.
Interesting. I want to go back to the family unit again. 80% of the people who report rape or have been sexually abused or, experience gender violence mostly are, they receive it from members of their family. Oprah Winfrey, for example, was raped by an uncle. And a couple of people who've been abused, whether male or female, have been abused by a close relative, a family member. Does this mean that maybe as the family unit, parents are not necessarily paying attention to their kids, especially now where everybody's, going in different directions and we're all trying to make ends meet and put food on the table? What do we need to do to, not let these things slip through the cracks?
I think, just as I said a few moments ago, that we have to embrace the humanity of girls and women. Actually, we have to embrace the humanity of children. I think our tendency, and I say I mean a global social tendency, is to think of children, though we're horrified to say it this way, but we often think of children as sort of these pieces of property that belong to the family. We don't think that we need to pay close attention to them. We think that little children don't understand and don't see, but in point of fact, today's children, 21st century children, what you think and see and feel at 5 years old is not unlike what you think at 25. We need to understand children's humanity first and foremost. I mean, I've often counseled some of my own family members to sort of look at children as people. I say, look at what you're doing. You're not listening to him. You're not listening to her. I think most families are well-meaning. And these conversations, if you think about it, these conversations are actually easier to have than sexuality conversations. And if we had them as a precursor to sexuality conversations, we actually would avoid a lot of harm. So when a little child, when Uncle so-and-so comes in and you say to the little girl, go hug him, go kiss him, and she says no, you have to respect her own agency over her body. Because it is rape culture when you insist that she go and kiss uncle or hug auntie. You must teach agency over the self, and you as an adult, we as adults have to respect that. So going back to the difficulty of the conversation, you don't even have to say the word sex or sexuality to teach the fundamentals, of what it is to respect bodily integrity.
Interesting. Let me talk quickly before we wrap this up, because we have just 2 minutes. For the women who stay in abusive relationships, the question is, why don't they live? People keep asking that question. Why do you think? And I see this across boards, whether it's in Africa or in the US. Half the time she says, oh, I fell, I scraped my face or my knee, or I hit my leg. You keep making these excuses. Why do they stay? Why don't they live?
Very often it's because they don't have familial or social supports. When I was a very young lawyer, my first job was working as an assistant prosecutor. And this is just an example of how societies think about this. But we newbies were often, what was the first cases litigated? Domestic violence cases. Because they figured, you have no experience, go do something that doesn't matter. And so one of my very first cases was a woman who had been abused by her husband, and he had used a steam iron to iron across her face. And there were the marks of the steam iron on it. And I was horrible. And she refused to prosecute at the end. She wouldn't be a witness, so we couldn't bring the case. And I sat with her and I said, why aren't you doing this? Why are you going back? And she said, because of my children, I don't feel that I can deprive them of a father. I don't feel that I can live alone. And this goes back to the need for women to be empowered to form families of affinity. Because if an abusive spouse will not support you, if your parents and siblings cannot support you, women need mechanisms to go out into the world and form their own families of affinity. That's the only way. I mean, I understood her need for support, but she needed another space to go, another social space to go in. And that we can build. That I think we can do. And we don't necessarily need law at all to do that. And I say as a legal scholar that law is a sieve with many holes. we need the society to help to shore it up.
So all hands have to be on deck. I want to say thank you, Ms. Lolita Buckner. Thank you so much.